Welcome back. So, this section we're going to talk about the importance of language, how you and I and others talk to victims and survivors of sexual violence. So, in this section, we're going to talk about how language is socially constructed and compare and contrast how language used to describe sexual violence impacts how it's understood by the greater society. So, we really try to encourage advocates to be aware of the importance of language and to challenge them on the way they speak. So, this training allows us to hold each other accountable for all-inclusive language. So, what do you call a carbonated beverage? Just curious. So, if you're from Minnesota, you probably call it pop or soda. Coke in the South. Soda more popular, maybe California or East Coast. I know when I went out to the East Coast and I asked for a pop, and the waitress looked at me like she had no idea what I was talking about. So this is where this plays into. So what did we learn from that? Language is not universal. Universal language is based on a common assumption that we're all coming from the same background and place, so we all know what we're talking about. Again, going to the East Coast, I said pop, and she looked at me like she had no idea what I was talking about. But does everyone really come from the same place and the same background? No. So why is the importance of language? Well, how is it socially constructed? We got the geographic location, we got gender, we got class, race, ethnicity, English as a first language, and age. If you look at our country and people coming in and speaking different languages, those are their first languages. So socially, well, Spanish might be their first language, or French might be their first language. So just taking into those importances of language. So have you ever heard the saying, rule of thumb? Well, that was an English law that men could beat their wives with an object that was no bigger than the width of their thumb. Isn't that a little crazy? All's well that ends well. Green-eyed monster. Language evolves. Effects of social change movements. Google and friends as verbs. Just Google it. It's a verb, right? So it's just how language has changed over time. So how can we help change the language of sexual violence? So I want you to think about these first two bullet points here. The victim experienced sexual violence. A woman was raped. Using the word experienced may minimize sexual violence into something that seems like an ordinary occurrence. Was subjected to may be a better descriptor, or calling it out for what it is. A woman was raped. So, when we look at changes of language in advocacy, it's important to recognize that more females are sexually assaulted than males, and it is because they are female. But the anti-sexual movement has started to recognize the need to acknowledge male victims and victims who do not identify in the binary send-up of gender. So we're looking at transgender, genderqueer. Rape was understood in many early laws as forced vaginal penetration with a penis, which obviously excludes a lot of victims. Sexual assault is still a term commonly used that is meant to encompass all forms of forced and non-consensual sexual acts. Sexual violence is now being used more often because the phrase sexual assault can minimize the violent aspect of any type of forced or non-consensual sexual act. It is also a broader term that encompasses acts that may not be defined in the sexual assault statutes, but which may be an experience by an individual as victimizing or invasive. We all recognize that the terms sexual assault and sexual violence are not as gripping as rape. Date acquaintance rape has moved to non-stranger. This is just basically essentially saying this person was not a stranger to me. And then victim or survivor. So the survivor recognized the resilience, strength, and courage victims have. However, sexual violence is victimization, which is only using survivor can minimize the aspect. It is important to note that it is up to individuals to determine how they identify. So really, we need to, when speaking with victims, we kind of have to cater our language to their language. We're going to use terminology they use. And how they define themselves. Do they define themselves as a victim? Do they define themselves as a survivor? Do they, looking at being inclusive, do they prefer he, she, her, him, their pronouns? So what do we hope after this video? We hope that we can challenge one another's language and accountability. We need to hold each other accountable for the language we use and how we speak to people.